on Soul Lounge Primetime, WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. This is the Night Watchman. DJ Leroy is not here. I think he got worn out yesterday at the Sunday sermon. Shout out to all of you who were out there yesterday. The best party in Harlem every year for the last 11 years running. Shout outs to DJ Storm and Norman. And shout outs to you on a nice, mild August evening here in the city. And although DJ Leroy is not with me, I'm pleased to invite back a guest who's been with us several times this year, Dr. Stephen Robinson from the Society of Cannabis Clinicians and Synergy Doctors. And, of course, we always count upon him to give us more information about medical cannabis. So, Dr. Steve, how are you this afternoon, this evening?
Yeah, I'm fine. Glad to be here.
Good. I'm glad to talk to you. The last time I saw you, you were recuperating a little bit from an injury. So, are you moving around a little bit better?
A little bit better. I think I can move around without the crutches now.
Okay.
But I'm still, under restricted advice, so I'm not able to get out and about as much as I used to.
So your family's bossing you around, right?
That'll be over soon. That'll be over soon.
Yeah.
But
good.
I'm certainly able to be with you and be across and coast to coast electronically.
Yeah, it's great. Technology can sometimes be a wonderful thing. So,
absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about medical cannabis. As you know, we were trying to get full legalization here in New York. We did not get that. We got some kind of a watered-down decriminalization, which is a step forward, but not the step we were hoping to take. And I think there's still some elements of the New York program that we're trying to, I think we'd like to see improve. But let's hear your thoughts on things these days and on the state of medical cannabis in general in the country.
Well, I think the issue is going to be fought at a state-by-state level. And there are, some states that are, even with their medicinal cannabis legislation, some states want to restrict it to CBD only preparations, which is a product of the cannabis plant, or they want to restrict it to just a product of a hemp plant, which means that it has less than 0.3% THC. Because the THC, people are, at least the legislators seem to be concerned that, THC has been in the past the drug that's been most identified with psychoactive effects or intoxication.
So those legislators, they're still running reefer madness on their VCR, correct?
Absolutely, that's exactly what they're doing, and I think that ultimately that really an approach to restrict access to CBD only is based on that kind of misinformation.
It's mind-boggling that misinformation is still out there. So I read something this morning online where they are now trying to pin the rash of mass shootings in this country on legalization of marijuana.
You have got to be kidding me.
I kid you not.
Now, I don't see how that certainly doesn't apply to Texas. Or the El Paso shooting, because I don't think Texas has any cannabis laws in effect.
That's correct, but those are just inconvenient facts. And it was an article in the New York Post. So they're sticking to their usual low journalistic standards. But they did quote some studies. I guess you can pretty much find a study to prove any point you want to prove. but I just it would almost be laughable, except that there are still people who take this stuff seriously. See, that's the reason why. It's not the guns, it's not the hate speech, it's the marijuana. That's it. Okay.
Right. It's just like blaming immigrants for the poor economy. It's another part and parcel of the scapegoating that takes place.
Sure.
People who are biased to begin with, you can't confuse them with any facts. And
But
it's unfortunate.
Let's talk about the good things about medical cannabis, because despite this type of misinformation, it's obviously been a march forward where more states, I guess, at this point in time, have some sort of medical cannabis program than those that don't.
Absolutely. And this is, by and large, a patient-driven movement. The doctors are going to wait until they've seen, randomized case-control clinical studies that will prove the efficacy of one drug versus another. And because of the prohibitions against cannabis, those studies have not been allowed to take place. The government has thrown a monkey wrench into doing adequate clinical research at every turn. And in fact, even though in the past, back in the mid to late 70s, the government did have a compassionate use program where they were actually growing, packaging, and distributing cannabis to a handful of patients.
Really? That's
the federal government was doing that, and they had a test farm attached to the University of Mississippi, which was responsible for growing all of the government cannabis, and they would roll it up into cigarettes and send it out in tins to a select number of patients who were allowed to participate in this compassionate use program. I think all but maybe one or two of those patients has essentially died, and the government closed the access to the program out several decades ago, but they still kept those handful of patients who were receiving government-grown cannabis.
Wow. Now, what government agency ran this program?
I'm not sure. It might have been NIDA, the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. I'm not sure which one it was that was administering the program, or it might have been the FDA. I'm really not sure. I could go back and look at it, but if you look at University of Mississippi and the medical marijuana program, you can find out.
Wow, never knew that.
And that farm exists to this day, and it is still growing government-sponsored cannabis, and that right now is the only legitimate source of cannabis that the government. A researcher at a university throughout the country wanted to jump through all of the federal hoops to do clinically related research. One of the requirements is that they could only use the government-supplied cannabis from the University of Mississippi.
Interesting.
Now, the problem with that is that cannabis represents the state of the art of cannabis back in the
30
60s.
years ago, 40, 50,
exactly.
50 years
so
ago.
the average amount of THC has been reported to be about perhaps on the order of 4 or 5%.
Wow.
Which is nothing compared to the kind of strength and potency of cannabis that's available currently. And so any kind of research that takes place with that is you're using cannabis, excuse me, which is not representative of what patients have accessible currently in the various states that have cannabis programs ongoing.
Mm-hmm. So where is the research coming from these days in cannabis?
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you just dropped out. Where is the what?
Where's the research coming from these days in terms of cannabis research?
Well, it's clearly outside of the country. It's taking place in Canada, in Spain, in the Netherlands, in Israel, and in England, for looking at cannabis as a whole plant preparation. Now, there's another avenue of development, and that's more of the pharmaceutical model, where drug companies will extract one or two components of the cannabis plant and package them into pills. So, for example, there are prescription medications available now in the U.S. that are synthetic THC capsules, and these are available through prescription. There are a number of brand names for them: Dronabinol, Marinol. These are all varieties of THC that a doctor can write a prescription for, and you can go to the pharmacy and you can get it. Okay, but it represents only the THC molecule, and that's been available probably since the 80s. And when the medication was used to combat nausea induced by patients receiving chemotherapy, or to promote appetite in patients who had cancer. Effective, but because it was just a single molecule, people found that the side effect of the psychoactivity was not tolerable. They didn't like the effect, and in fact, when you use the whole plant preparation, you get a variety of chemicals, a variety of cannabinoids and terpenoids, which will modify the impact of the psychoactivity induced by THC. So
I want you to go over that again, and I know we've talked about it in the past, but for somebody who might be tuning in for the first time, I want to underscore a little bit more about the plant and cannabinoids and just what is represented when you mention THC versus CBD, and
Sure.
So if you could tell us a little bit about cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system.
Okay, so cannabis has been used by civilizations as a medicinal plant for thousands of years. The cannabis has been written up in ancient Egyptian medical texts and ancient Chinese medical texts, and there's evidence that it has been used as medicinal even before recorded history. Okay, before the people started writing down these medical texts that are thousands of years old, there's evidence that even before people started using writing to write down these preparations, that it was in use as a medicinal on thousands of years before that. The plant itself produces a complex mixture of, right now we've identified over 100 cannabinoids, and these are compounds that are fairly unique to the cannabis plant. In addition to the 100 or so cannabinoids, the plant also produces a number 30 or 40 aromatic compounds called terpenes. And these are the kinds of chemicals that cannabis shares with other fruits and vegetables. So that if you can crush up some pine needles and smell them, you're smelling a terpene called pinene. If you crush up lavender flowers, the smell and the aroma you get is linalool. Mangoes produce a particular characteristic called myrcene. Black pepper, you crush up some black peppercorns, and you can smell the beta caryophyllene.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those aromatic compounds in various degrees and combinations have been found in cannabis as well. And these are what give the different strains of cannabis their own particular unique aroma.
Mm-hmm.
So that you've got, some kinds of, cannabis that are called skunk or dank or purple. These all have respective combinations of terpenes, which give each of those strains their unique aroma.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell these things apart by smell itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the cannabinoids are not aromatic. You don't smell those. These are not volatile at room temperature, but you can smell the terpenoids.
Mm-hmm.
Now, all of this combination, this complex mix of 100 or so cannabinoids and the 30 or 40 terpenoids are all found together in the one plant.
Mm-hmm.
So when either you crush it or eat it or smoke it, you're getting a complex blend of all of these compounds.
Mm-hmm.
The cannabis plant makes two prominent cannabinoids. One is called THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and this is the compound that has the psychoactivity. Okay, this is the kind that has the intoxicating effect, and some people like it, some people don't like it. You can take low doses and you feel high. If you have an excess amount, it can make you feel paranoid, anxious, and even if you take too much, it can cause hallucinations and transient psychotic episodes. And this is the compound that people have been really concerned about, that produces all of the kind of allegations of abuse potential.
And this is also the compound that determines whether the legality or illegality of having it or using it.
Essentially, yes. This is the compound that people were targeting on as for all of their efforts and to prohibit the spread of cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second most prominent cannabinoid is CBD, cannabidiol,
mm-hmm.
and this is a compound which is not psychoactive directly, so it doesn't get you high, but people have discovered that it has a lot of other activities within the body, and it has prominently it has a very role in reducing inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
And it also tends to increase the effectiveness of the body's own endocannabinoids.
Mm-hmm. So the body has an endocannabinoid system. Everybody has this, right?
And not only do people have it, but all of the primates, the family most the animal family most akin to humans,
mm-hmm.
but it's found in the animal kingdom all the way down to invertebrates.
Mm-hmm.
So this endocannabinoid system is a vast intercellular signaling system that most animals have.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only discovered in the late 70s, early 80s, and 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And it was discovered because these researchers were really looking at where in the body this molecule, this THC, was effective.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the technology advanced to the point where they could tag on radioactive labels to these compounds, and when they injected it into animals and in people, they found certain areas of the body lit up.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did they light up inside the brain, which is what you would expect for a psychoactive compound, but also in the spinal cord and throughout the nervous system throughout the body, but in addition throughout the gut, the GI tract, on immune cells, in the liver and the spleen, in bone and articulated joint surfaces. And so these systems, with the point where these compounds were active, were throughout the body.
Mm-hmm.
And this was so extensive that they discovered that the body has particular receptors for the cannabinoids in the plant, which was kind of curious. Why would the body have receptors for these external compounds?
Mm-hmm.
And then they began to look closer and closer, and they discovered, just like endorphins, where the body makes its own endogenous morphine-like compounds,
Mm-hmm.
they found that the body makes its own cannabinoid-like compounds. And this system of these compounds and their receptors and all of the enzymes that are used to create these compounds and to metabolize these compounds form this vast system that before the 80s and 90s had not even been discovered.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called the endocannabinoid system. And it's an extensive system that the external plant-produced cannabinoids interact with.
Mm-hmm. So
and
that's amazing. So we have a system that permeates our entire body. In fact, we have it, animals have it, and the substances in the cannabis plant, the cannabinoids, actually interact with this system in a positive manner to I guess it promotes healing and the body's ability to recover. How does it interact with the body to promote health benefits?
These external plant-produced cannabinoids, called phytocannabinoids,
Mm-hmm.
enter the body and can activate some of the receptors that already exist within the body,
Mm-hmm.
that are activated by the body's own endocannabinoids. So you can actually, in a way, it acts like a supplement
Mm-hmm.
to the body's own internal cannabinoid system.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these can do a number of things. They can produce excitatory effects, or they can produce inhibitory effects.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on...
I have to ask you what those terms mean.
Okay, so if you've got, say, a nerve cell,
Mm-hmm.
And the nerve cells communicate by sending electrical impulse down the axon or down the railroad tracks that end and then connects up to another train on another track.
Mm-hmm.
This whole sort of like system of say like telephone connections.
Mm-hmm.
If you have an impulse that can interact with this signaling system, in some cases it can amplify the signal, in which case it becomes stimulatory.
Mm-hmm.
Or in some cases, when you interact with it, it can turn down the signaling, and it becomes inhibitory.
So that it, practically speaking, does that mean that, for example, for pain management, that would be a situation where it might be inhibitory, where if you're experiencing pain, it would turn down the volume on it?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right. And that happens at several levels within the body,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of pain in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Some compounds can, in fact, at the peripheral level, say if you burn your finger on the stove,
Mm-hmm.
at the local burn area, you've got some sensory nerves there that tell you've got an injury.
Mm-hmm.
That nerve impulse travels up through your arm, through the spinal cord, up to your brain,
Mm-hmm.
and the brain is registering that pain in your finger.
Mm-hmm.
And then the brain is also sending nerve impulses back down the spinal cord to say, move your finger off the stove,
Mm-hmm.
otherwise you're going to have more damage, and also sends other kinds of signals down to your finger.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people have found that cannabinoids can, in fact, reduce the local pain signals coming from your finger.
Mm-hmm.
The cannabinoids can also stimulate some inhibitory impulses that can reduce that pain signaling from the spinal cord,
Mm-hmm.
and it can also, at the brain level, reduce your perception of the pain.
Mm-hmm.
So it can function to reduce your sense of pain at multiple levels within the body.
Mm-hmm.
And different compounds that the plant makes, different cannabinoids, can also act on different levels to alter your pain perception.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, what are some of the areas where we've seen medical cannabis and cannabinoids to be most effective?
Well, one of the most dramatic cases that's gotten a lot of press on news media has been the dramatic impact of the compound CBD
Mm-hmm.
on children who have a number of epileptic syndromes.
Mm-hmm.
That where they have Dravet syndrome or other genetic syndromes that subject them to dozens, if not hundreds, of seizures a day.
Mm-hmm.
And this is obviously has a tremendous impact on their growth and their quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
People have found out that particular strains of cannabis that came out of Colorado and parts of California that had a high percentage of CBD
Mm-hmm.
Were amazingly effective at dramatically reducing the number of seizures these children have every day. And they get dramatic reductions in the number of seizures that they're suffering from. This information led initially, before a lot of the pharmaceuticals started to investigate this. Initially, it led to people, whose children were suffering from these syndromes to pick up and move to places like Colorado or California, where they could get access to this medication, and they became sort of like medical refugees because they could not get the medication in the states that they were living in.
Mm-hmm.
Now there is a pharmaceutical company in Great Britain I believe it's called GW Pharma, which has gone through and completed FDA clinical trials using a plant-derived CBD that they've repackaged into capsules and I believe there's other formats of liquids, which they've put through clinical trials, and they've had patients in New York and California who've had these devastating illnesses, and they've shown that it's been effective. It's gone through all of the necessary FDA trials to establish the effectiveness, and it is now available on the market for treating these epileptic syndromes.
Interesting.
And that's been dramatic. The other medications that I mentioned, the pharmaceutical medications, the straight THC, either as Marinol or other prescription medications, have been shown to be effective in reducing chemotherapy-induced nausea.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are drugs that are available through the pharmacy as well.
Mm-hmm.
But using the pharmaceutical drug, if you're in a non-medicinal cannabis state, or using cannabis that you can get at a cannabis dispensary, would be also effective in dealing with the chemotherapy-induced nausea for patients who are suffering from that.
Mm-hmm. So let's take a break. I want to play a little bit of music, and then when we come back, I want you to talk a little bit more about Synergy Doctors and how there's an opportunity to actually do consulting around medical cannabis online. So
sure.
We will be right back after some music.
Okay.
Dance with me, come on, dance with me, baby. Dance
Soul Lounge Primetime on a Monday evening, WHCR 90.3 FM. This is the Night Watchman, and I've had my guest on, Dr. Stephen Robinson of the Society for Cannabis Clinicians and also Synergy Doctors. Oops. Music just wants to keep going. So, Dr. Steve, I wanted to talk a little bit about you are involved with a website called Synergy Doctors, and can you tell us a little bit about what you guys do?
Yeah, I've been working with a number of other doctors who are providing cannabis evaluations in a number of states. It started out in California, but we now have branches in Georgia and also in New York, where I started my medical training. And for those patients who are interested in getting evaluated, there's a website facility called synergydoctors.com. And, as you know, the medical programs are established on a state-by-state basis. And each state determines, what qualifying conditions patients have to have in order to qualify as a legitimate cannabis patient. And a number of states have a list of conditions that patients have to have. And that varies in terms of, how narrow or broad that is. California being the first state in the union that legalized medicinal cannabis back in 1996, had a specified list of conditions, cancer, HIV, multiple sclerosis, chronic pain, and they also had a provision that allowed doctors to use their medical judgment to make the determination that the patient, whatever their condition, could be helped by medicinal cannabis, which, opened up a broad array of conditions that had been allowed to be used to certify a patient as legitimate medicinal cannabis patients. So glaucoma, for example, PTSD, epilepsy, other kinds of conditions which some states may and some states may not accept as legitimate. California was very, very broad and left that up to the physician's discretion. New York, on the other hand, has a very set list of conditions that patients need to have if they're going to qualify. Cancer, of course, HIV or AIDS, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, neuropathy. There's a whole list of them that patients can look at either our site at synergydoctors.com under New York, or they can go to the New York State medical marijuana program and review the list of conditions that would qualify them to become a medicinal cannabis patient. So the site that we have allows patients to go to our site if they are definitely certain that they have one of these conditions and they want to get certified as a New York State patient. They can go to our site and register. They will be able to upload their medical information and it's all a HIPAA secured site. So that maintains a medical confidentiality. they'll be able to upload the information and set up an appointment, and they will be seen most likely by myself. And we will have an interview, and I can review their medical records. And if they do qualify, then I can register them as a New York State medicinal cannabis patient. If they need, if they're not certain whether or not they qualify, and they want to talk to a doctor as opposed to a bud tender or their partners or their buddies about whether or not their particular symptoms can be helped by cannabis or what kind they would need. If they just want to have that exploratory discussion, our site does have a consultation phase where they can upload some information, but it will not automatically lead them to a registration as a cannabis patient. But they can have that discussion with me about whether or not their condition would qualify them for a cannabis card in New York State. The advantage of going through the consultation is that to get certified in New York, you have to be a New York State resident. But if they just want information, they could be basically anywhere in the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and they could talk about, their conditions and whether or not their conditions might be helped by medicinal cannabis, and without having to go through and become a certified patient in New York State.
Now, how are doctors in general reacting to medical cannabis?
Very slowly. That I've seen a couple of studies out of out of Colorado, for example, produced by the Colorado Academy of Family Medicine, and they did a survey of all of the family practitioners in Colorado and found that only about 4% of them were comfortable writing recommendations for their patients to get medicinal cannabis, which is really unfortunate because there's a real gap between what patients feel can be helpful and what doctors feel comfortable writing about. Unfortunately, when I referred back to the endocannabinoid system and the fact that it was only really discovered in the late 80s and early 90s, most of the doctors in practice never had exposure to medicinal cannabis or cannabis per se as anything other than a drug of abuse. So they may be taught about cannabis along with cocaine, methamphetamine, speed, heroin, as a drug of abuse and viewed as, one of the detrimental substances out there that could wreak havoc on patients' lives and family situations. But they've never had any instruction about the whole array of enzymes, receptors, agonists, and ligands that are associated with the endocannabinoid system because most of the doctors went through school before it was even discovered. And even now, very few medical schools have incorporated teaching about the endocannabinoid system in their curriculum. And that's, the other organization I'm affiliated with, the Society of Cannabis Clinicians, has developed educational programs to address that gap. And in fact, the Society of Cannabis Clinicians is one of the providers of the curriculum necessary for New York State physicians to take in order to meet the requirements and to be able to certify patients in New York State for medicinal cannabis.
So, Dr. Steve, we're coming to the end of the show. I want to thank you for sharing this great information, and we are going to repost this on YouTube as well for those who may not have checked it out live. And I guess the sites that people can check you out on is synergydoctors.com, and then what's the site for Society for Cannabis Clinicians?
That is cannabisclinicians.org is the site, particularly for medical providers, clinicians, PAs, nurse practitioners, pharmacists, to get more of the education and the scientific background on the endocannabinoid system and using cannabis in clinical practice. And for patients, that's synergydoctors.com /New York, and that is where patients can log on and have that discussion to determine if they want to get a certification in New York or if they just want to talk about their own particular situation as a consultation.
Yep. All right. Well, once again, thank you for joining us. Harlem Dance Party is up next, and we will be back next week on Soul Lounge Primetime.